Blood might be thicker than water, but when my son's heartbeat was fading, family could not save him. Only money could. The people who gave me life chose to keep their wallets shut and leave my boy to die. They thought they pushed me into the abyss. They did not realize that was where I sharpened my claws. Welcome to America, where karma is never late. It just waits to charge the highest interest rate. Hello and welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories. We want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for your continuous support. But unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating, which means we will be forced to stop uploading new videos here in the near future. To keep bringing you content, we are moving our operations to Patreon. So if you enjoy today's story, please support us by joining our Patreon community, where you will find exclusive, true stories that are much longer and more detailed than what we can publicize on YouTube, featuring multiple emotional voice actors, bringing every single scene to life. You can join us right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us dive directly into today's story, seen through the desperate eyes of our protagonist, Vivian Morrison. The wiper blades of my ancient sedan screamed against the cracked windshield, fighting a losing battle against the torrential Seattle downpour. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned a bruised shade of white, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. At 32 years old, I had faced my fair share of storms, but absolutely nothing could prepare me for the hurricane tearing through my chest tonight. Sitting on the passenger seat, illuminated by the frantic, strobe-like flashes of passing streetlights, was a thick manila folder. Inside that folder were the medical records of my 5-year-old son, Miles. He was lying in a sterile, freezing hospital bed clear across town, his tiny chest fighting a losing war to pump blood through a heart afflicted with a critically rare congenital valve defect. Just 2 hours ago, the doctors had delivered a miracle. They had located a perfectly matched artificial heart valve. It was a revolutionary experimental surgery, and it was his absolute only chance at survival. But miracles in America come with a massive price tag. The hospital administration demanded an upfront, out-of-pocket payment of $100,000 before they would even prep the operating room. My health insurance would not cover a single dime of the experimental procedure. I abandoned my car directly in the valet zone of the towering downtown luxury high-rise, caring about the angry shouts of the concierge running after me. I sprinted through the opulent, brightly lit marble lobby, leaving a thick trail of muddy rainwater in my wake. My soaked clothes clung to my freezing skin, but the only chill I felt was the ticking clock of my son's failing heart. I practically punched the button for the private elevator, riding it up to the penthouse while my breath came in ragged, desperate gasps. The polished metal doors slid open with a soft, elegant chime, instantly swallowing me into a world that felt like a different planet. The air inside my mother Evelyn and my stepfather Marcus's penthouse was suffocatingly warm, smelling intensely of roasted cedar and wildly expensive Tom Ford perfume. Soft jazz hummed pleasantly from hidden surround sound speakers, a stark, sickening contrast to the raging thunderstorm outside. They were lounging comfortably in their massive sunken living room, the floor-to-ceiling windows displaying the violent storm outside, as if it were merely a silent movie meant for their evening entertainment. Marcus was swirling a glass of vintage champagne, his feet kicked up on a leather ottoman. Evelyn was perched on the edge of a velvet sofa, admiring her fresh manicure under the warm glow of a designer lamp. Standing in front of this massive stone fireplace was Julian, my half-brother. He was the golden child, an insufferably arrogant tech bro who wore his unearned confidence like a tailored suit. He was in the middle of pitching some ridiculous cryptocurrency project, wildly gesturing with his hands and boasting about how he could multiply their investment 3 times over in just 1 month. I did not knock. I did not announce myself. I practically crashed into the living room, a soaked, trembling mess of a mother pushed to the absolute terrifying edge. Julian stopped his energetic presentation, his face twisting in immediate disgust. I ignored him completely. I slammed the damp medical folder onto the pristine glass coffee table. shattering the quiet aesthetic of their evening. "I need the money," I choked out, my voice cracking violently under the immense weight of my terror. "Miles is dying. They found a valve. They can save him right now. Tonight. But I need $100,000 for the surgery. I need you to pay me back." Exactly 1 year ago, Marcus's media company was on the brink of absolute ruinous bankruptcy. To save his fragile reputation and maintain their lavish lifestyle, I had drained every single penny of my life savings, a fund I had been painfully building since I started working, and loaned them $100,000. I gave them everything I had when they were desperate. Now, I was just asking for my own money back to save my little boy from dying. Julian clicked his tongue loudly, crossing his arms and rolling his eyes dramatically at the ceiling. "Christ, Vivian, do you always have to drag your toxic energy into this house? We were in the middle of a serious business discussion. You always bring such bad luck and drama. Maybe if you had not made the brilliant choice to be a broke single mother, you would not be begging us for handouts like a stray dog." I lunged forward, my vision flashing red with sudden rage, but I forced myself to look only at Marcus. I dropped to my knees right there on the expensive Persian rug. "Please, Marcus, Mom, it is my money. I saved your company when no one else would. Miles has maybe a few hours left to live. Please, just wire the hospital the funds. I am begging you on my hands and knees." Marcus set his crystal champagne flute down with a sharp, dismissive clink. He looked down at me, his eyes entirely devoid of human empathy, staring at me like I was a stain on his carpet. "Let us get one thing straight, Vivian," he said, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather forecast. "That money you gave me? Consider it retroactive payment for the cost of your mother and me raising you all those years. It is gone. Furthermore, investing $100,000 into a terminally ill kid is a terrible, losing bet. My capital needs to stay right here to let Julian multiply it. I am not throwing good money into a sinking ship." I gasped loudly, the air leaving my lungs as if he had brutally kicked me in the stomach. I turned my tear-streamed, horrified face to my mother. "Mom, please, he is your grandson. He is flesh and blood." Evelyn did not even meet my eyes. She deliberately turned her head toward the roaring fireplace, adjusting her silk shawl to ward off a chill that did not exist. She chose her wealthy husband and her golden boy, just like she always did. "You should leave, Vivian. You are upsetting Marcus," she whispered coldly, her voice devoid of any maternal warmth. Before I could even gather the breath to scream, Marcus picked up his phone and pressed a button on speed dial. "Security? Send someone up to the penthouse immediately. We have an unhinged intruder." I tried to grab the folder, tried to scream reason into their empty souls, but the heavy oak doors of the elevator opened rapidly, and two massive security guards stepped out into the foyer. Marcus walked over, grabbed my worn tote bag from the floor, and violently hurled it out into the hallway. The guards grabbed my arms, hauling me backward without an ounce of gentleness. I kicked, I thrashed, I screamed until my throat bled, crying out for my mother, crying out for my helpless son. Marcus stepped to the doorway. He looked at me one last time, an expression of utter contempt and irritation on his face. Then, he slammed the heavy wooden door shut. The loud, metallic click of the deadbolt locking echoed through the hallway like a fatal gunshot. I collapsed onto the freezing cold marble floor of the corridor. Outside the massive hallway window, a tremendous crack of lightning tore through the black Seattle sky, fiercely illuminating my trembling, empty hands. I sat there in the suffocating silence, staring at the closed wooden door. In that exact fraction of a second, something deep inside of me violently snapped. The desperate, pleading, loving daughter died right there on that marble floor. I realized with terrifying clarity that my family was truly dead. They were just greedy corpses walking around in designer clothes. I slowly dragged myself up by the wall, my tears stopping completely, drying up into something hard and sharp. A dangerous, icy calm washed over my burning veins. The countdown for Miles's life was ticking down in mere minutes, and I had a hospital to get back to. I tore through the hospital corridors like a hunted animal. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like a swarm of angry hornets, casting a sickly pale glow over the linoleum floors. I pressed my hands and face against the freezing glass of the intensive care unit. Miles looked so unimaginably tiny, swallowed by a tangle of tubes and wires that were the only things keeping him tethered to this world. His skin had a terrifying, translucent grayish-blue tint. The heart monitor beeped with a slow, agonizing sluggishness. Next to me, the head pediatric surgeon stood with a clipboard, his face drawn with grim sympathy. He checked his watch and sighed heavily. "Ms. Morrison, I am incredibly sorry. The hospital administration has established a hard, absolute deadline. We have exactly 15 minutes left before the payment portal closes. If the funds are not secured by then, protocol mandates that the donor valve must be flown to the secondary recipient in Portland. I cannot stall them any longer. 15 minutes, 900 seconds. I had absolutely nothing, no family, no money, no hope. The air in my lungs turned to shards of broken glass. I was going to watch my son die right on the other side of this glass window, purely because I did not possess a piece of paper with enough zeros on it. Then, the rhythmic, synchronized clicking of expensive heels and dress shoes echoed down the barren hallway. It was a sharp, commanding sound that cut through the sterile quiet of the hospital ward like a knife. I turned my head. A tight formation of 6 people dressed in immaculate, tailored black suits marched down the corridor. They moved with the terrifying, predatory grace of apex predators entering a sheep pen. At the center of the phalanx was a woman who commanded the absolute gravity of the room. Valerie Vance, even I, someone entirely disconnected from the corporate world, recognized the legendary, ruthless self-made billionaire venture capitalist from Silicon Valley. She wore a pristine white trench coat draped over her shoulders and oversized sunglasses that she removed with a swift, calculated motion as she approached. She stopped directly in front of me, her piercing gray eyes scanning me from head to toe, assessing my entire existence in a fraction of a second. "Vivian," she said, her voice a smooth, icy blend of absolute authority and unshakable calm. "Your husband was the most brilliant cybersecurity engineer I ever had the privilege of employing. 6 months ago, before he passed away, he quietly embedded a proprietary encryption algorithm into my corporate mainframe. Last week, that specific algorithm triggered and single-handedly saved my entire tech empire from what would have been a catastrophic, historic data breach. He saved me billions of dollars." She paused, her intense gaze locking onto my tear-filled eyes. "The desperate letter you mailed to my corporate office 2 days ago got buried under a massive mountain of executive mail. It finally reached my desk 1 hour ago. We immediately took my private jet." Valerie did not wait for my shocked, trembling response. She snapped her fingers loudly. A tall, imposing man stepping out from behind her, her chief financial officer, walked directly up to the bewildered head of hospital administration, who had just scurried out of his office to investigate the commotion. The CFO reached into his dark leather briefcase and slapped a heavy, embossed, open-ended bank guarantee onto the metal counter. The loud smack made the administrator jump out of his skin. "This is a certified, unlimited financial guarantee from Vance Global Holdings," the CFO stated, his tone freezing the air around him. "Open the operating room and prep the surgical team right this exact second. If there is a delay of even 1 single minute. Tomorrow morning, Valerie Vance will purchase this entire hospital network and immediately terminate every single person standing in this hallway. Do we have a crystal clear understanding?" The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Money talks, but immense, terrifying wealth screams. The hospital administrator turned a shade of chalk white, frantically scrambling for his walkie-talkie and barking rapid, desperate orders. The sterile hallway erupted into organized chaos. Nurses rushed into the room, alarms were disabled, and a specialized transport team descended upon the ICU. I stood completely paralyzed, my back pressed hard against the cold glass, watching through pouring tears as the double doors burst open and Miles was rapidly wheeled out toward the surgical wing. My little boy was suddenly surrounded by a massive army of the best medical staff in the entire state. As the chaotic noise faded down the corridor, the heavy silence returned. Valerie stepped beside me, looking down the empty hallway where they had taken my son. She reached into her coat pocket, produced a perfectly pressed, monogrammed silk handkerchief, and pressed it firmly into my trembling palm. "You have the undeniable resilience of a cornered wolf, Vivienne," she said quietly, but the sharp steel in her voice was unmistakable. "You fought tooth and nail when the entire world abandoned you. Once your son is fully recovered, I want you to come work for my firm. Understand this clearly. I do not hand out charity, and I do not offer pity. What I am giving you is a loaded weapon. I am giving you the opportunity to learn how this ruthless world actually works, so you can meticulously crush the people who thought they could leave you and your child to die in the dirt." 10 grueling hours later, the surgical doors finally swung open. The lead surgeon walked out, pulling off his cap, a genuine, exhausted smile spreading across his face beneath his mask. The experimental procedure was a flawless, resounding success. I stood over Miles in the pediatric recovery room, listening to the rhythmic, beautiful, and profoundly strong beeping of his new heart monitor. Each beep was a triumphant victory song against death. I reached out and gently stroked his warm, pink forehead. I stared at the jagged green line jumping energetically across the screen, a lifeline that had been bought and paid for by cold, hard power, right then and there, in the quiet, sterile hum of the recovery room. I made a silent, unbreakable blood oath. The naive, forgiving Vivian was dead, buried forever under the rain of that Seattle storm. If money and power were the absolute only languages this cruel country understood, then I would become completely fluent. I would become an absolute monster if it meant I could build an impenetrable, towering fortress around my son. The exact second, the lead cardiologist signed the final discharge papers for Miles. The woman known as the old Vivian completely ceased to exist. I did not merely move to a new apartment. I systematically eradicated my previous life with surgical precision. I walked out of my cramped, depressing rental unit, leaving the meager security deposit and every single piece of cheap, worn-out furniture behind. I drove straight to a telecom store, smashed my old phone with a rock in the parking lot, and purchased a secure, encrypted device under a newly registered corporate LLC. I spent an entire evening permanently deleting every single social media profile, scrubbing thousands of digital footprints, photographs, and connections from the internet. I became a total ghost. I hired a specialized privacy firm to ensure my name would never appear on public registries again. We moved into an ultra-exclusive, high-security residential complex that did not even exist on public city maps, accessible only by a biometric checkpoint and guarded by armed former military personnel. To Marcus, Evelyn, and Julian, I had completely and utterly evaporated from the face of the earth. True to her word, Valerie Vance did not forget me. Exactly 1 week after Miles came home, I walked through the heavily tinted, bulletproof glass doors of Aegis Vanguard Partners. It was a shadowy, elite corporate restructuring and crisis management firm, secretly bankrolled by Valerie's vast empire. The office smelled of ozone, fresh ink, and predatory ambition. I started at the absolute bottom of the food chain as a mere intern, surrounded by arrogant Ivy League graduates who looked at my lack of pedigree with thinly veiled, elitist disdain. They had trust funds, prestigious connections, and a safety net. I had absolutely nothing but the searing, agonizing memory of a heavy oak door slamming in my face while my son was rapidly dying. That single memory became my limitless nuclear reactor. I worked 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, without a single complaint. I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning and routinely fell asleep under my desk long after midnight. I drowned myself in towering, suffocating stacks of complex financial disclosures, obscure tax documents, and dense bankruptcy filings. I aggressively taught myself how to brutally dissect a corporate balance sheet to find the rotting flesh underneath. I learned how to hunt down hidden assets, masked by shell corporations, and how to weaponize obscure legal loopholes to corner our targets. While my wealthy colleagues took extended coffee breaks and golfed on weekends, I ruthlessly studied the predatory psychological tactics of the most feared negotiators on Wall Street. I actively trained my mind to view the entire world entirely in stark black and white, in columns of profit and loss, completely devoid of any human sentiment. Whenever sheer physical exhaustion threatened to break my spirit, whenever my vision blurred and my hands shook at 2 in the morning, I simply closed my eyes. I forced myself to listen to the phantom sound of the freezing rain from that terrible night. The fatigue would instantly vaporize, replaced by a cold, burning rush of pure adrenaline. One entire year passed in a relentless, dizzying blur of endless spreadsheets and cutthroat boardroom battles. I violently shed my intern title and rapidly ascended the corporate ladder, leaving a long trail of stunned, defeated executives in my wake. I began commanding my own field operations, orchestrating the hostile takeovers and aggressive financial restructuring of failing, bloated enterprises. The corporate business world is infested with sharks, but I realized very quickly that most of them are driven by fragile egos and petty greed. I was driven by absolute, primal survival. I completely removed all emotion from the equation. In high-stakes negotiations, I transformed into a stone wall. I never raised my voice. I never made empty, emotional threats. I simply slid thick manila folders across polished mahogany tables, filled with irrefutable, devastating numbers and crippling legal ultimatums. I offered powerful men a very simple choice between a painful financial amputation or total, absolute corporate death. They always chose the amputation. I rapidly became the firm's undisputed apex predator, the executioner they sent in when the situation required zero empathy and maximum collateral damage. My defining, star-making moment arrived during a notoriously vicious, protracted acquisition battle. We were attempting to swallow a mid-sized, highly profitable logistics conglomerate that was fiercely resisting the merger. Their chief executive officer, a pompous, arrogant man who reminded me far too much of my stepfather Marcus, sat across from me in the mediation room. He smugly rejected every single offer, mocking my age and boasting loudly about his company's supposedly bulletproof financial valuation. But he had made a fatal, irreversible mistake. He vastly underestimated the woman sitting across from the table. After 3 grueling days of digging relentlessly through thousands of pages of deeply buried subsidiary tax returns and offshore banking logs, I found the fatal flaw. It was a massive, off-the-books mountain of toxic, crippling debt, cleverly hidden through a convoluted web of shell companies and offshore accounts. In the past, a traditional corporate negotiator would have quietly used this highly sensitive information as leverage to force a slightly better purchase price behind closed doors. The old, naive Vivian might have even felt a brief pang of pity for the thousands of innocent employees who would inevitably suffer. The new Vivian did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. Instead of bringing the explosive evidence to the private negotiation table, I anonymously leaked the entire, unredacted financial dossier to 3 major international financial news outlets, exactly at midnight. The next morning, the financial world erupted into absolute, unmitigated chaos. When the opening bell rang on the stock exchange, the logistics company's stock went into an absolute, uncontrollable freefall. By noon, exactly 40% of their total market capitalization had violently vaporized into thin air. News anchors were shouting, shareholders were panicking, and the company was bleeding millions of dollars by the minute. I walked casually into the panicked chief executive officer's private suite that afternoon, flanked by my silent legal team. The arrogant smugness was entirely eradicated from his face, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. He was sweating profusely, his hands shaking violently as he desperately barked orders into a phone, trying in vain to salvage his rapidly ruining empire. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not say a single word of triumph. I simply pushed a newly revised, brutally unforgiving contract across his mahogany desk. The new purchase price was literal pennies on the dollar, a completely humiliating defeat. He stared at the devastating number. looked up at my dead, unblinking eyes, and slowly signed the document with a trembling pen, a completely and utterly broken man. The very next morning after the monumental acquisition officially closed, Valerie Vance called me up to her expansive top-floor executive suite. She poured 2 glasses of incredibly rare, expensive scotch, handing one crystal glass to me. She raised her glass, a rare smile crossing her fierce features, and officially promoted me to the highly coveted position of senior partner at Aegis Vanguard. I had finally arrived at the absolute summit of the mountain. With my first massive, multi-million-dollar executive bonus, I purchased a sprawling, high-tech fortress of a mansion sitting proudly on the highest, most exclusive hill in the wealthy Seattle suburbs. It was entirely surrounded by reinforced steel gates, 32 ultra-high-definition night vision security cameras, and a private, armed security detail that patrolled the perimeter 24 hours a day. That evening, I stood on my expansive glass balcony overlooking the glittering city skyline, sipping a glass of wine. I watched Miles running happily and energetically across the pristine, manicured lawn below, playing fetch with his new golden retriever. His artificial heart was beating strong and steady. Our future was permanently secured. I had successfully built an impenetrable, untouchable financial empire around us. The frightened, desperate, crying mother begging in the rain was gone forever, permanently replaced by a ruthless titan who held the heavy gold keys to her very own invincible kingdom. My second year at the absolute summit of Aegis Vanguard Partners was defined by a profound, untouchable silence. It was the exact kind of pristine quiet that only immense, unapologetic wealth and power can successfully purchase. My existence had become a perfectly calibrated machine of authority and tranquility. Miles was thriving beautifully. He was growing taller and stronger with every passing week. His days filled with private tutors, specialized swimming lessons, and endless laughter echoing through the cavernous halls of our secure estate. He was entirely shielded from the harsh realities of the outside world, heavily guarded by the absolute best security apparatus money could buy. Our lives were a towering fortress of peace, completely severed from the toxic roots of my past. I had long stopped actively thinking about the people who had callously left my son to die. I was simply too busy conquering the financial world to ever look backward. However, when you control the flow of data at the highest echelons of corporate intelligence, the past has a funny way of casually drifting across your mahogany desk. It happened on a random Tuesday afternoon. Aegis Vanguard utilizes a highly sophisticated, proprietary algorithmic radar that constantly scans global financial markets for massive defaults, toxic debt clusters, and impending corporate bankruptcies. It helps us identify bleeding companies to acquire or dismantle. My lead intelligence analyst, a sharply dressed young man named David, walked into my corner office and handed me a thin blue folder. He mentioned that a peculiar, highly volatile cluster of high-risk defaults had triggered our early warning system in the local sector, and the primary guarantors attached to the toxic debt were names he recognized from my highly classified internal conflict of interest disclosures, Evelyn and Marcus. I did not blink. I calmly instructed David to quietly compile a comprehensive, fully detailed dossier on their current financial and legal standing, and to leave it on my desk by the end of the day. When I finally opened the thick file that evening, pouring myself a glass of expensive red wine, I fully expected to find a mundane story of poor business management or foolish stock investments. What I uncovered instead was a masterpiece of poetic, devastating irony, the magnificent cryptocurrency project that Julian, the arrogant golden child, had been loudly pitching on that stormy night 2 years ago was never a legitimate technological endeavor. It was a complete, spectacular illusion. Julian was not a visionary tech entrepreneur. He was the desperate architect of a massive, incredibly reckless Ponzi scheme to maintain the glittering facade of his fake company and to pay off early investors with incoming capital. He needed a constant, massive influx of fresh cash. When his well inevitably ran dry, He turned to the two people whose blind, unconditional worship of him made them the absolute perfect victims. The meticulously compiled dossier revealed that Julian had secretly and methodically stolen Marcus and Evelyn's identities, using forged digital signatures and their pristine credit histories. He had taken out dozens of exorbitant, predatory loans from unregulated shadow lenders. He had quietly signed away their luxury vehicles, drained their extensive retirement portfolios, and placed multiple high-risk, catastrophic mortgages on their beloved luxury penthouse. He pumped millions of dollars of their stolen wealth into his failing scam, burning through their entire legacy just to buy himself a few more months of fake success. Marcus and Evelyn, utterly blinded by their narcissistic pride in their perfect son, never noticed the financial noose tightening around their necks until the trapdoor violently swung open beneath them. The collapse was absolute and spectacularly fast. Just 48 hours before this intelligence file landed on my desk, the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, flanked by heavily armed federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, had violently raided the glass headquarters of Julian's fraudulent empire. But the federal agents found an entirely empty executive suite. Julian, the beloved prodigy, had ruthlessly drained the final reserves of untraceable offshore cash and fled the country on a private charter jet in the dead of night. He left absolutely everything behind, including his doting parents, who were now the sole legal guarantors of a colossal, smoking crater of toxic, fraudulent debt. The legal and social fallout was merciless. By the time I turned the final page of the dossier, Marcus and Evelyn's entire reality had been utterly vaporized. Federal authorities had immediately frozen every single one of their bank accounts pending a massive fraud investigation. The massive financial institution holding their fraudulent mortgages had forcefully seized the penthouse, locking them out onto the street with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs. Their elite, high society friends, the exact same people they had desperately sought to impress by sacrificing my son, immediately turned their backs, treating them like infectious lepers. In less than 2 days, they had plummeted from the arrogant peaks of high society directly into the terrifying, penniless abyss of criminal investigations and absolute ruin. I sat in the quiet luxury of my office, listening to the soft crackle of my stone fireplace. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I closed the thick dossier. I did not need to make a single phone call. I did not need to leverage my immense corporate power or orchestrate a complex, vindictive plot. I stood up, walked over to the heavy-duty paper shredder in the corner of my office, and dropped the entire file into the spinning steel blades. I watched the names of my former family turn into meaningless ribbons of confetti. I realized right then that Karma is a remarkably efficient debt collector, and she had just flawlessly foreclosed on the people who sold my son's life for a handful of dust. It was the dead of winter, a bitterly freezing night in late December, the kind of bone-chilling cold that freezes the moisture in your lungs before you can even exhale. Inside my estate, the climate control kept the air at a perfect, balmy temperature. The grand foyer smelled faintly of roasted cedar and expensive wax, a deliberate, mocking mirror to the luxurious penthouse they once owned. I was wide awake in my private study, finalizing a massive overseas corporate merger, when the silent perimeter alarm suddenly triggered. The primary security console on my heavy mahogany desk flashed a brilliant, urgent crimson. I tapped the glass screen, bringing up the ultra-high-definition infrared video feeds from the outer security wall. Through the swirling, aggressive snowstorm, the thermal imaging displayed 2 small, fragile heat signatures desperately clinging to the massive wrought iron gates at the very bottom of my private driveway. They were shaking uncontrollably, their bodies pressed hard against the freezing metal bars. I immediately switched the video feed to the standard night vision lens. Even through the distorted static of the heavy falling snow, I recognized them instantly. It was Evelyn and Marcus. They looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, polished high society elites who had violently thrown me out of their home 2 years ago. They looked like hollowed-out, starving ghosts. I later learned that they had scraped together the absolute last of their hidden physical cash, literal pennies, compared to the immense wealth they used to flaunt. To hire a shady, black market private investigator, they paid him to hunt down the exact location of the daughter they had completely discarded and left for dead, desperately praying for one final, miraculous lifeline. My head of security buzzed the intercom, asking respectfully if he should dispatch the guardhounds or call the local sheriff to remove the trespassers from the boundary line. I stared at the glowing monitors for a long, quiet moment. "No," I said, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of any emotion. "Open the outer gate. Let them walk up the long driveway in the snow. Escort them into the main foyer, but do not let them step past the entry hall. I will be right down." I wanted them to see it. I wanted them to walk through the impenetrable, glittering fortress I had built entirely from the ashes of their cruelty. I took my time. I slipped into a long, dark emerald silk robe that cascaded smoothly over my shoulders, sliding my feet into soft velvet slippers. I walked slowly out of my study and approached the grand, sweeping marble staircase that overlooked the massive entry hall. Below me, the heavy steel reinforced front doors had just closed, sealing out the roaring blizzard. Marcus and Evelyn stood shivering violently on the pristine white marble floor. They were a horrifying, pathetic sight. Their clothes, once expensive designer brands, were now torn, heavily soiled, and soaking wet from the melting snow. They reeked of stale urine, wet garbage, and the distinct, unmistakable odor of the city slums. They were dripping dirty, freezing water all over the expensive imported stone. I stood at the very top of the stairs, looking down at them like a queen surveying trespassing peasants. I slowly descended the steps, the soft rustle of my silk robe being the absolute only sound in the cavernous hall. As I reached the bottom landing, radiating the untouchable aura of total, crushing power, Marcus looked up at me. His sunken eyes widened in absolute shock and terror as he took in the sheer magnitude of my wealth. His trembling legs completely gave out beneath him. He collapsed hard onto the marble floor, a broken, pathetic old man incapable of even standing in my presence. Evelyn immediately broke down into hysterical, ugly sobs. She dropped to her bruised knees, crawling frantically across the wet floor, her dirty hands reaching out as if to grab the hem of my silk robe. "Vivienne! Oh my God! Vivienne! Please!" she wailed, her voice a scratchy, desperate shriek. "You have to help us. Julian took absolutely everything. He stole our identities. He forged our names. He took every single dollar we had and ran away. The banks took the penthouse. They took the cars. We have been sleeping under highway overpasses for 3 weeks. We are freezing to death out there." She gasped for air, wiping a vile mixture of snot and freezing rain from her hollow face. "The federal investigators are coming for us. They think we were part of his scam. We are going to a federal prison. Vivienne, I am your mother. I gave birth to you. Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. You have so much money now. Just give us a tiny room in the basement. Just pay off the legal debts so we do not die in a jail cell. Please, have mercy on your own flesh and blood." She stayed on her hands and knees, staring up at me with wide, pleading eyes, desperately waiting for a shred of the empathetic, loving daughter she had once known. I did not move a single inch. I did not step backward in disgust, nor did I reach out a warm hand to comfort her. I just stood there, towering over her, my eyes as cold and unforgiving as the Arctic ice raging outside the thick walls. I did not speak a single comforting word. I simply let the suffocating, heavy silence fill the massive room. I let that terrible, agonizing quiet stretch on and on, using the absolute silence as a physical weapon to slowly, methodically crush the very last remaining fragment of their self-esteem. I let Evelyn sob until her voice completely gave out, reducing her frantic, hysterical pleading into pathetic, wet gasps. The massive entry hall of my estate remained completely silent except for the sound of her ragged breathing and the distant, muffled howling of the winter blizzard beating against the reinforced windows. I stood perfectly still, letting them drown in the suffocating weight of their own absolute ruin. When Evelyn finally slumped forward onto the wet marble, completely devoid of any remaining dignity. I slowly bent my knees. I crouched down until my face was perfectly level with Marcus. He flinched, shrinking backward like a beaten dog, but he could not look away from my eyes. The arrogant, untouchable media mogul who had violently thrown my dying son out like yesterday's garbage was gone. In his place was just a terrified, shattered old man facing the consequences of his own monstrous greed. I leaned in slightly, the faint scent of my expensive perfume cutting through the foul stench of the streets they had dragged in. I looked directly into his wide, bloodshot eyes, making sure he heard absolutely every single syllable. "Mother, Marcus," I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and sharper than a freshly honed razor blade. "Do you remember the $100,000 I begged you for to save my son's failing heart? Do you remember telling me it was a losing bet?" I paused, letting the icy dread fully wash over their pale faces as they suddenly recognized where this was going. "Consider the exact cost of your total bankruptcy, your miserable homelessness, and your impending federal arrest today as the retroactive payment for me teaching you how the rules of this life actually work," I whispered. "I am not throwing good money into a sinking ship." The absolute, paralyzing horror that contorted their faces was the most beautifully satisfying thing I had ever witnessed. It was a flawless, undeniable reflection of the sheer terror they had forced me to endure on that rainy night 2 years ago. Marcus opened his mouth, desperately trying to formulate some kind of defense, some pathetic excuse, but his throat was completely paralyzed. He choked on his own breath, realizing with devastating clarity that I had just used his exact cruel words to permanently seal his coffin. Evelyn let out a weak, agonizing whimper, burying her dirty face into her hands as the final crushing reality of their doom settled over them. I stood back up, smoothing out a tiny, invisible wrinkle in my emerald silk robe. I did not feel an ounce of rage anymore. I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, glorious emptiness where my pain used to live. Without breaking eye contact with the broken man on my floor, I raised my left hand and firmly pressed the glowing communication button strapped to my wrist. "Security team," I commanded, my voice echoing with unyielding authority through the grand hall. "Physically remove these two vagrants from my property immediately. If they linger within a 1-mile radius of the perimeter, you are to hand them directly over to the county sheriff for criminal trespassing." From the shadows of the adjoining corridors, 4 massive security guards materialized instantly. They moved with terrifying, silent precision. 2 guards grabbed Evelyn by her shoulders, lifting her completely off the ground. The other 2 grabbed Marcus by the collar of his ruined coat and the belt of his trousers, hoisting his limp body into the air. "No, Vivienne, please, you cannot do this. We will die out there," Evelyn screamed, thrashing wildly as they dragged her backward across the polished stone. Marcus just stared at me, his eyes entirely vacant, his spirit completely and permanently broken. The heavy steel front doors were pulled violently open, letting the roaring, freezing wind whip through the foyer. The guards threw them out into the raging blizzard with zero hesitation. Evelyn's desperate, agonizing shrieks were instantly swallowed by the howling wind. The massive doors slammed shut with a heavy, definitive thud. The deadbolts automatically locked into place with a loud metallic click. The storm outside was entirely silenced. I stood alone in my magnificent foyer. I closed my eyes and took a long, deep breath, letting the warm, cedar-scented air fill my lungs as I exhaled. The suffocating burden of my past, the lingering trauma of rejection, and the burning need for revenge completely washed out of my body. It was finally over. The debt was paid in full. I turned around and began walking up the sweeping marble staircase. My footsteps were incredibly light. I walked down the softly illuminated carpeted hallway and gently pushed open the heavy oak door to my son's bedroom. The room was bathed in the gentle, warm glow of a small star-shaped nightlight. The air smelled of clean cotton and baby lotion. I walked over to his large bed and sat softly on the edge. Miles was sound asleep, wrapped tightly in his thick, plush blankets. His cheeks were a healthy, vibrant shade of pink, his chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. I reached out and gently placed my palm flat against his small chest. Beneath his ribs, I felt it, the strong, undeniable, and beautiful beating of his heart. It was a rhythmic pulse of pure victory. I smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached all the way to my soul. I realized in that quiet, sacred moment that true family has absolutely nothing to do with shared blood or a common last name. True family are the people you are willing to burn the entire world down to protect. I leaned down, kissed his warm forehead, and whispered a quiet goodnight. We were safe. The monsters were locked outside in the freezing dark, exactly where they belonged, and our kingdom was completely at peace. Thank you so much for listening to this story with us today. We deeply appreciate your time and would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. So please let us know in the comments, as we mentioned earlier, because YouTube has completely demonetized our channel. We do not have the budget to keep operating here, and we will forcefully stop uploading new videos on this platform in the near future. We are moving our operations entirely to Patreon. If you enjoyed today's story and want to help us survive, please support us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon community. There, you can listen to the absolute best, highly detailed, and completely exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publicize on YouTube. You can easily join us right now by scanning the Patreon QR code visible on your screen, or by clicking the direct link provided in the description and the pinned comment below. Thank you once again for your incredible support. And we cannot wait to see you over there.